obviously it's the privilege of Kahlil and I as moderators to pick the topics. So we are able to pick ones we're really interested in. And this is something we're talking about education. Now, a lot of people think that one of the aspects of gambling is it's a poor choice. There's a lot of myths and stereotypes and even stigma about gambling, that people are just making poor choices, or if they knew what the chances were, or if we can just sort of teach people how to gamble correctly, correct some erroneous beliefs, then that'll be a way to reduce gambling problems. So this has been something that's taken up around the world by policymakers and regulators, as well as researchers and prevention experts, of what is the right mix? How can we have conversations? We have moved away from the idea that just providing information is sufficient, little sticker on the side of the machine that says what the chance is, or some sort of very dense instructional booklet explaining exactly the mechanics of a gambling machine and expecting that to change anyone's beliefs and behaviors. But today we're going to get into this topic with two experts who've been doing work in this area, looking at youth education as well as education on the casino floor. So I'll turn it over to Kahlil to introduce our experts. And just to keep in mind as well, we do have an upcoming webinar that's going to focus particularly on postgrads. So if you have any postgrads at any level of candidature that would be excellent to share their initial thoughts or more completed findings, please share that information. Encourage them to submit a topic through our webinar homepage. And now over to Kahlil.
Well, thank you very much, Sally, and welcome back, everybody, to another exciting seminar. As Sally mentioned, this is going to be, I think, an interesting conversation around gambling education that I think ties in well with the conversation that we had last week. I know there are a few different themes that are overlapping that you'll hear more about today. But without further delay, allow me to introduce the two speakers that we have for today. So first is Heather Gray. Heather Gray is the Director of Academic Affairs at the Division on Addiction, Cambridge Health Alliance, a Harvard Medical School teaching hospital. Dr. Gray's current research includes an evaluation of the MGM GameSense program in partnership with UNLV, the Building Cultures of Recovery in Tribal Nations program in partnership with the Healing Lodge of the Seven Nations. I'm not going to skip that one because there's too many letters, and the GVC-Division on Addiction Research Collaboration. Previously, Dr. Gray led the Division on Addiction's evaluation of GameSense in Massachusetts, which is part of the reason why she's here today. She's also the senior editor of the Brief Addiction Science Information Source. So welcome very much. Welcome to the conversation, Heather. Also joining us today is Brittany Keene. Brittany has been employed as a research assistant at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney for over 6 years, where she also completed her PhD last year. Her research focused on gambling education for adolescents as a means of prevention amongst adults, as a means of harm minimization. That's the reason why she's here today. Dr. Keene has also worked collaboratively on a number of different gambling-related projects in the areas of self-exclusion, venue staff training, new and emerging technologies, and open science practices. So welcome, Brittany, as well. And as you can see, we have two speakers that have done recent work in this area, so we're lucky to benefit from them. So without further delay, I'm going to pass the conversation over to Heather for her opening presentation. So Heather, you, like I just mentioned, you led the first significant evaluation of on-site gambling education centers in the United States, that being the GameSense program in Massachusetts. So I was hoping that you could take us through your experience and any insights that you gleaned out of that program, keeping in mind that I've asked you to do this in 10 minutes or less. So Heather, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Kahlil, and thanks to you and Sally for organizing the series and inviting me to join in this week. Before I describe our work in Massachusetts, I want to first introduce you to my friend and colleague, Mr. Ed Talbot, because his experiences might be helpful to keep in mind as we discuss this topic. So many years ago, Ed started working at a dog track, and not long after that, he started betting himself. And then some problems started to emerge for Ed. He started to miss important family events because he was at the track, or if he had a big loss at the track, he would leave and chase that loss at another track. All this time, he thought he just had a money management problem. And things got really, really bad for Ed, to the point where he lost his job, lost his marriage, considered taking his life, before he finally realized that he had a real problem with his gambling. I'm glad to say that Ed found a path to recovery over 40 years ago. And now he dedicates his professional life to helping other people. So if you are like me in the great state of New Hampshire and you call our gambling helpline, you'll get Ed on his cell phone just about any time, day or night, and he'll try to offer you what he desperately needed, which is empathy, compassion, information, and a path towards recovery. So what kinds of programs could have prevented Ed from developing his gambling problem in the first place, or at least have helped him recognize it before it got so bad? That's a question Massachusetts legislators asked when they expanded gambling. So they ultimately required that the new casinos do several things to try to mitigate harm from new gambling opportunities, and one ended up being GameSense. So all 3 casinos in Massachusetts are required to host independently run GameSense info centers. And casino patrons can go to these centers if they want to take a break from their gambling. And those who staff the info centers, GameSense advisors or GSAs, they'll try to initiate conversations about gambling, responsible gambling strategies with patrons there in the center and also out on the casino floor. So what are some potential benefits of a program like GameSense? Next slide, please. Thanks. So I lump the potential benefits into 2 main categories. One is responsible gambling education. And we normally think of this as a primary prevention strategy because it's targeted to people who haven't yet developed problems with their gambling. And the idea is to prevent those problems from emerging in the first place. As you'll learn more throughout the session, RG education includes teaching about concepts like randomness and chance in gambling outcomes. And the hope is that this kind of education will counteract otherwise salient gambling distortions like, I've been at the slot machine for hours, I must be due for a win, and therefore would reduce gambling or help people stay within their limits. So there is some evidence that some engaging materials are effective in teaching about these concepts. I know that Mike Wall and Sally and others have tested animated videos and found them to be effective in some conditions. And Brittany will be discussing this in more detail in her session. But we have a lot of questions to ask about this, especially when we move this approach from the laboratory setting out into the casino floor. So one big question is, will we be able to get patrons to engage with these kinds of materials? They're coming to the casino to gamble, not for education. So will we be able to get them to watch videos, read pamphlets, to try to learn about these concepts? And then does this approach translate into face-to-face teaching? So as I mentioned, the GSAs in Massachusetts try to teach about these concepts, and they do so very often through face-to-face conversations. But I think it's an open question as to whether that works in changing gambling beliefs. And then another really big question is, does this kind of education, even if we succeed in changing beliefs, correcting gambling myths, does it succeed in changing gambling behavior? So there's a lot to question there. And then the other main category of potential benefits has to do with problem gambling resources. We normally think of this more as secondary prevention because it's aimed at preventing emerging problems from getting worse. And this can include things like screening for problem gambling and having knowledgeable, friendly staff who can help gamblers recognize if they've started to develop an unhealthy relationship with their gambling. And it can also include voluntary self-exclusion. In Massachusetts, people who go through voluntary self-exclusion enrollment tend to find that it is a very supportive process rather than punitive. And the GSAs try to use it to provide a pathway to treatment, including providing local treatment resources. Next slide, please. So of course, this program is really well-intentioned, but good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. And so we really need to try to understand whether it's working. And to answer this question, I like to conceptualize program impact as the product of program reach and effectiveness. This comes from the public health literature, in particular smoking cessation work. They've conceptualized program impact in this way. So once we do this, we still need to answer several more questions. So for instance, what constitutes reach? Or who are the targets of the program? So in the case of GameSense in Massachusetts, we could consider all of the residents of Massachusetts to be the targets, because GameSense is delivered in the casino, but its message goes well beyond the casino. So there are messages on billboards, they have a YouTube channel, they have Twitter, other social media. We could consider the targets to be those patrons who are on the casino floor, or we could get even more narrow and say that casino patrons with gambling problems are the targets. In our evaluation in Massachusetts, we considered casino patrons to be the targets of the program, but you could measure it in other ways. And then another question is, well, what counts as having been reached? Does seeing a billboard count as being reached by the GameSense program? Or do we need to be more stringent and say that you have to have spoken with a GameSense advisor to have been reached? In our work, we used the latter definition. We calculated how many people of those who visited the casino each day spoke with a GameSense advisor. We found that rate hovered right around 1% in our published study. And then we've actually calculated it in a different way in our work with MGM, with the casino in Springfield, Massachusetts. And again, using a different measure, we found it still to be right around 1% of people who go in and actually speak to a GameSense advisor. And so I think this raises a question of what level of reach do we consider to be sufficient? To my knowledge, the Gaming Commission Massachusetts hasn't set a benchmark for that yet. And then what constitutes effectiveness? So is imparting information about gambling and safer gambling strategies enough to be considered effective? We found that of the relatively small group of people who had a conversation with a GameSense advisor about these topics, most of them said that they did learn something about gambling, and they learned strategies to keep gambling fun. So that could be one measure of effectiveness. But then when we asked a question about a gambling belief, we found that the majority of those who had had a conversation still got it wrong. So even within this category, there are different ways to measure it. What about changes in attitudes? So maybe patrons exposed to this program take on the attitude that it's not shameful to ask for help for gambling problems. That might count as evidence of effectiveness. We found pretty consistently that patrons who spoke to GSAs really liked them, said that they would turn to them if they had a problem with their gambling. And that echoes something that Jamie Weed said last week about GSAs in Canada being really good about forming relationships with patrons. We found the same thing in Massachusetts. And I think back about Ed when he was in the early stages of his gambling problem, if he had had a caring, knowledgeable person at the track who helped him realize what was happening, that could have made all the difference to him. Or finally, we could say that behavior change is necessary as evidence of effectiveness. And that's really, really tricky, though, because most people who gamble don't have problems with their gambling. And they don't see a need to change their behavior. They're not motivated to change their behavior. We found in our surveys about 84% of people said that they had had no gambling problems. And so tricky to get that behavior change if it's not really needed in the first place. Of course, for some it will be, but you have to figure out who needs it. And so finally, I'm really left wondering if we need multiple measures of impact. So maybe if you're looking at the population of gamblers as a whole, then that healthier change in their attitude about being willing to seek help if they need it, or decreasing stigma for problem gambling is a real solid measure that the program is having impact. And then at the same time, maybe if we're dealing with a much smaller target population and those individuals, we would need behavior change to conclude that the program is working. So I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Kahlil and also to Brittany and Sally so that they can answer all these tough questions. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. And I'm just struck, and this is something that I've pondered for a long time as well. As with these programs, we spend tens of millions of dollars annually, in many jurisdictions, and it's the type of program is growing. Yet, as you've outlined here so well, there's many open questions, and these are open questions coming from the jurisdiction that's probably spent the most amount of money trying to answer these research questions. So, a lot of work yet to be done. Thank you for that overview. I'll hand the conversation over to Brittany now. So Brittany, you defended your dissertation last year, as I mentioned in the opening, about educating young people on gambling, so a different audience. So if you wouldn't mind taking us through your key learnings in that area.
Yeah, thanks, Kahlil. And I want to thank Kahlil and Sally for having me on. I've been following this series pretty much since the first session, so I've been really been enjoying it. I guess I want to kind of talk about gambling education as it applies as we use gambling education for prevention with young people, and sort of move through to gambling education as a harm minimization approach with adults or with adult gamblers. And I did 2 studies in my PhD that I want to sort of talk about both things. But as a background with gambling education for prevention, I suppose we are typically looking at young people, as prevention implies. We want to try and prevent harm before it actually occurs. So you really do need to be intervening early in people's lives. And this often does mean intervening before, people are even starting to gamble. So we see a lot of school-based gambling education programs. This is a great place to disseminate this kind of information en masse to young people. And Bob Lattiser talked about targeted versus universal gambling education programs in a paper that he wrote. And the difference there is really that targeted education programs are sort of focusing on a specific group of people, maybe that have specific risk profiles or characteristics which we might expect them to go on to be more at risk for gambling problems. So maybe young males in this scenario. Whereas universal-based programs are just sort of a shotgun approach to everyone. And there's benefits and downsides to both, but I think there might be a little bit more of an argument for universally based gambling education programs, because we know that from longitudinal research, the trajectory of gambling problems is a little bit messy. And so if you have this targeted program, you might miss some people who don't fit that profile, but might still go on to develop problems. So traditionally, a lot of gambling education programs have been this sort of fear-based approach, focusing on the negative consequences of gambling. And this sort of stems from, this Just Say No drug campaigns of the late 80s and 90s that were sort of introduced by Nancy Reagan. And if we looked at other fields like drug and alcohol education, we can see that these fear-based kind of programs really don't resonate with young people. So the DARE program is a really good example of this. It's the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, and it was in use until 2009 in the United States. And despite being one of the most widely implemented and well-funded school-based drug education programs, we're talking nearly $1 billion of multiple meta-analyses, so multiple studies of studies which have shown that it's ineffective. So there's been a real need to shift away from these fear-based kind of approaches. And with gambling education, we've done a lot of work in this field, and a lot of gambling education programs nowadays tend to focus on, as Heather was saying, we're trying to focus on reducing myths and misconceptions and trying to promote a better understanding of what are the odds of actually winning and more realistic expectations of gambling. So in my PhD, I evaluated gambling education animation that my supervisor, Dr. Fadi Angel, developed. And this tried to break down or give a better understanding of the gambler's fallacy. So for anyone that doesn't know, as it applies to slot machines at least, so in my research, we looked at electronic gaming machines. So the gambler's fallacy in that scenario essentially is the idea that after a string of losses that you'd be due for a win. And this animation tried to break down this misconception by teaching a little bit about the gambling, the maths that sort of disprove it. So randomness, and that over the long term, you'll lose more money than you'll win. And it used visualizations and graphs to do this. And we're certainly not the first people to try and look at education animations in gambling. So there's been a few studies, but we've had some really mixed results. A few of the studies that I put there, so Lambos and Del Fabro, they looked at differences between problem gamblers and non-problem gamblers on measures of numerical reasoning or understanding, and found that there was no difference between the two. Williams and Connolly found that educating about maths didn't really change people's gambling behavior at all. Whereas there's been some positive results as well. So Maria Anna Donati and Michael Wall have done some studies where Maria Anna Donati specifically with adolescents has demonstrated that an education program for young people that really focused on breaking down misconceptions was successful in doing that. And actually it resulted in a lower frequency of gambling amongst adolescents. So mixed results in this sense. In my research, we wanted to see, was this approach more engaging for young people than your typical fear-based approach? Were we able to help them learn these concepts about randomness and negative payoff? And could we actually reduce misconceptions amongst adult gaming machine players? So ran that study with adults as well. We can go to the next slide. So what did we learn? Well, we showed that at least what it looked like, the animation significantly reduced misconceptions amongst our adult gaming machine players. And there was an improved understanding of these mathematical concepts, but no more than our comparison videos, which were more fear-based. And the adolescents that we collected data from, they did not find the content relevant at all, unfortunately. And we didn't see any sort of improvement in terms of their understanding of maths. But this kind of makes sense when you look at what these adolescents are actually gambling on, which is not EGMs at all. This is not gaming machines, which makes sense. I mean, they were 17 years old. So in Australia, you've got to be 18 years old to be able to play gaming machines. Not that that typically stops adolescents being involved in other forms of commercial gambling. But only 6 people in my sample said that they gambled on gaming machines, and they didn't find this very relevant or engaging. So we kind of concluded, okay, well, if gambling education is to stay in schools, perhaps it does belong somewhere embedded in the mathematics curriculum, in something that's sort of rooted in something that is already relevant to them, something they're already learning and building on. But we need to make these examples far more relevant. So in my sample, the adolescents were betting personal bets between friends, sports betting, simulated forms of gambling, so free online casinos. And I think that that's perhaps better examples. And also, I won't go into it, but we need to make the intervention briefer. I'll go to the next slide. And wave at me, Kahlil, I'm nearly done, I promise. So the very last thing that I wanted to touch on is gambler education. So looking at adults, and I just wanted to show a few of these images here, because this is essentially how we are communicating wins and losses, people's own personalized wins and losses to gamblers as consumers. So these are some online wagering operators like Sportsbet and TAB, in Australia, very popular online sports betting companies. And as you can see, it's not particularly intuitive about how much money you've won or you have lost. There are these transaction lines that display every transaction or every bet that you've placed, but there's no one running cumulative total of how much you're up or how much you're down. And I'll go to the next slide. And this can be really problematic because we know that people really tend to overestimate how much money that they win gambling. Michael Wald did a study where he asked loyalty card players how much money they thought that they'd spent, and the actual amount of money that they'd spent was about 13 times greater than that. The Productivity Commission put out did a similar thing in Australia, and it turns out that Australians overestimate how much they spend on gaming machines by a factor of 30. So they underestimate how much they spend, they overestimate how much they're winning. And so there's been some really good studies in this area in terms of educating people with accurate information, just explaining to them, hey, this is how much money you've actually spent or how much money you've actually won and lost in terms of reducing their subsequent expenditure. It looks like information about how much money you've actually spent compared to generic warning messages like gambling is risky. The expenditure tends to be more effective. And this comes from a whole host of social psychology research in terms of nudging people in the right direction of making, as we said, better informed decisions. But thinking about how we can best communicate this, and I just keep thinking where we are at the moment with COVID-19, the best way that we've been sort of communicating to the public about where cases are, how they're rising and falling over time is through graphs. And there's a reason for that, because graphs are a fantastic way to summarize really complex information and in a really intuitive way. So I think there's a long way we can go there in terms of for consumers, for gamblers as consumers, to be able to get information to their own player data for educational purposes.
Thank you very much, Brittany. And I appreciate you giving that overview of a very complicated set of literature. I'm sure that was quite fun to comb through as you wrote the first couple chapters of your dissertation. I'm going to move the conversation back over to Heather, and this is almost a question that I'm just personally interested in. And it's about the challenges of these RG education programs. So when GameSense, the name GameSense was first selected, as I've heard the story, it was picked because they tested out a bunch of different words, and it was picked because it was something that didn't necessarily connect the idea of responsible gambling to any of the problem gambling related themes that people viewed as aversive to actually interacting with somebody like a GameSense advisor. So Heather, my question for you is that, even with employees, but, with consumers a lot too, there's a conflation of responsible gambling and problem gambling. Did this emerge at all as an issue in Massachusetts? And do you have any thoughts on whether those things should interact in gaming venues?
Good question, Kahlil. So we didn't see much evidence that was a concern with GameSense in Massachusetts. I mean, people did say that they didn't have gambling problems themselves. And when they did interact with GameSense advisors, when they chose to do so, it was really just because they were curious about the program. I mean, they walked in and they saw these nice folks walking around in their green shirts. And this whole thing was new to Massachusetts and to the casino patrons. The idea that it's run by the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling rather than the casino itself. That was something that was really intriguing to the casino patrons. And the majority of them just wanted to stop by and see what the program was all about. And in that sense, it seemed like the idea of the program being conflated with problem gambling as just a resource for people with gambling problems, that didn't seem to be an issue, and that we were finding in Massachusetts.
That's interesting. And I'm going to ask another question. For those people who know him, I feel like I'm channeling the ghost of Paul Smith, even though he's still alive and well. But these are a few of the comments that he would always give. So this is my question for Brittany. So Brittany, there's a lot for youth in particular. There's a lot of these public health educational needs during formative years. So you alluded to some of them when you talked about the fear-based messaging or other messaging, which is, drugs, alcohol, sex, many different things that parents and educators have, a belief that, that's probably more important for wellness of adolescents or children than gambling in particular. So, given this fragmentation, as far as public health messaging goes, should we not just be focusing our efforts of responsible gambling education when people actually reach legal gambling age or even show some interest in gambling? Like, do you find any strong reason why we should be doing this type of education program with youth?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, throughout my PhD and sort of really looking into this, there were a few things I think that really challenged me as well. You read a lot of literature which suggests, most of the literature on adolescent problem gambling suggests that adolescents have problem gambling rates 3 to 10 times higher than that of adults. But then that's not typically something, if you ask, maybe, at least when I ask the clinicians, at our clinic, it's not something that we typically see a great need for in the community. And you also see this sort of juxtaposed in the literature, because the authors of the Canadian Adolescent Gambling Inventory, which is a measure of adolescent problem gambling, when they were doing their validation studies, they were aiming to validate the scale in a sample of adolescents in treatment for problem gambling. And they state in their paper that despite a Canada-wide search looking for adolescents in treatment, they were unable to locate one adolescent in treatment for problem gambling. Now, this doesn't mean that adolescents are not suffering with gambling problems. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But it does raise the questions about, well, what are we trying to do with these education programs? Are we trying to reduce the incidence of problem gambling amongst adolescents, because that's actually more of a treatment intervention? Or are we actually trying to target healthy individuals, but with education and information that's actually going to prevent them from developing problems in the future? And that's something that I think we certainly do have a fantastic opportunity to do. So while I agree that, we don't tend to see these problems until I think later on down the track, the opportunity to intervene early and especially embed these really healthy ideas and more appropriate understandings of just how unprofitable gambling is, because certainly gambling advertising does not help us in our efforts there, then that's where I think we can truly actually achieve some good quality prevention, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense when we think about, what's the lifetime return on investment on educating people. For, it's the longest for the youngest people who will live longer. So that, and certainly as we look at, prevalence rates by age group, it's always youth that seem to be skewed higher. So that does make a lot of sense. Thank you, Brittany. Heather, I wanted to follow up on a few different things that came up in your presentation. And I think this actually ties into the question that we got from Eric. There's a lot of mixed results, and I think we both agreed that there's a lot of open questions about the effectiveness of these programs. Is there anything that you found that you can point to that says, this is an area where we do see some return on investment of time and money spent, that if anybody's watching this, whether they're a regulator, an operator, or somebody else, that says, okay, here's an idea that there is some validity and maybe we should be investing more in this area?
Yeah, so to that, I would say not so much in terms of the RG education or the ability to correct gambling misperceptions among the casino patrons, mostly because, as I mentioned, the patrons weren't interested in getting that kind of education for the most part. But as I mentioned, just really, really consistently, we found that people liked the GameSense advisors, and just the fact that I think it was something like 95% of them who had an in-depth conversation with one said that they would turn to one for help if they ever had developed a gambling problem. And so I just imagine, what if we had people like that at bars or at liquor stores? I mean, if we had a person right there to try to catch someone just as they're starting to fall, a person who seems friendly and trustworthy, just the idea of that support person, I think, especially these days, right, when we're all so disconnected, putting aside the specific education that's happening, just that relationship with the GSA emerged to me as one of the most favorable findings and most consistent. And I think that if we could maybe take this idea from the problem gambling literature of addiction being an unhealthy relationship between a person and an object or a behavior, and just sort of shift that up to primary prevention. And so we get everybody thinking, just from the very beginning of their gambling history, what is the relationship to you with gambling? Is it a healthy one? What is gambling doing for you? What is gambling doing to you? Are you having fun? Those kinds of more motivational interviewing questions, if we could get people to start thinking about those kinds of issues even before they're starting to have gambling problems, I think that could be really, really useful. And we can take the whole label of problem gambling and the stigma associated with it right out of the equation and normalize it, so people are starting to think about these kinds of things before problems are emerging. That's what I see. That's the best part of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me too. Being somebody who oversaw the GameSense advisor program in British Columbia for a period of time. Certainly, I would hear these types of stories of people who built relationships, and then, when they did have issues, that they felt like they had that trusting relationship that sounds a lot like a therapeutic relationship, but it's almost a friendship as well in some ways, particularly in small towns or more local type casinos. The challenge I always struggled with was, is this the right place to spend our money? And is that these aren't cheap programs to run. So if we think about where do responsible gambling dollars best get spent, it's hard to make those trade-offs. Brittany, I have another follow-up question for you. I know, and I just want to kind of explore all of these ideas, and kind of, because there is kind of a duality to all of these different programs. I know you found some specific practices that do seem helpful, but as part of what you're doing, did you find any unintended consequences with the messaging that you provided, or the different interventions that you created?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily about unintended consequences. So unfortunately, we didn't have enough data. We collected follow-up data at 3 and 6 months after the education intervention, but we did not have enough data to do any sort of inferential statistics. So it's difficult to see, long-term, because I wanted to look at, well, what is the actual impact on people's gambling behavior long-term? But and as Heather was sort of saying, recruiting gamblers can be notoriously difficult. They're not particularly interested, especially if they're not actively seeking treatment either. They're not particularly interested in being involved in these sort of interventions. So that was tricky. But if I had any advice for anyone who's wanting to go into gambling education research, or using, animations or videos or digital delivery, I could definitely recommend making the intervention quite brief. So the videos that we had were between 15 and 20 minutes long. And it doesn't sound like a lot of time, but when you're asking someone to sit down and watch it and complete pre and post measures, it is a lifetime, and you can see it on their faces. And so I would certainly recommend making these interventions quite brief. Controlling the settings as well, making sure that people actually do watch the video or complete the intervention. So with the adolescents in my study, when I actually looked at the data in terms of the time spent on watching the video, despite instruction not to, and despite me trying to embed some things in the website, they often skipped past the actual animation. So I had to cut half of my sample because I couldn't guarantee that they had actually watched the full intervention. So I couldn't run the stats on the intervention effects for that. So having a very controlled environment, making sure you can ensure the intervention effects. And I do, the last thing as well is that a focus on behavioral data, I think, is really important. I think we've talked about this a lot of people have talked about this the past few weeks in these seminars, that working with gambling companies, being able to access, player data, it would give us insights that we can't necessarily get anywhere else, because we really do need to know, are these interventions, as you said, we're spending tens of millions of dollars sometimes, are these interventions having an effect on people's actual gambling behavior? I think that's something we really need to focus on.
Can I ask one follow-up question, Brittany? As someone who's read a lot of the literature in this area, I'm just curious what your sense is of it compared to, say, tobacco. My brief readings of it in the past have been, there's a few good studies, and then there's a few like really idiosyncratic studies that I don't know if I can generalize from them to anything at all, other than the specific setting in which they were conducted. What's your sense of what we actually know as far as the literature? I know you pointed to a few studies, but like, what would you say are the key things you should actually pull out of that literature?
It's also really important. And I know this is something that's talked about a lot as well, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of replicating studies, because it's really difficult to know that if you do one study under particular, conditions and with a particular intervention, a particular sample, and they all, as you said, it's really difficult to know, was the result that you found from that some sort of idiosyncratic finding, or is this something that we can actually generalize to the psychology of this disorder? So it's really important that we try to do the same studies over again. Do we get the same result? Really try to triangulate all of these findings, because I agree. I actually think it is quite disparate at the moment. I think there's a few things that I feel that I think are really promising, but I need to acknowledge my own bias. And am I just cherry picking out the things that I think are going to be a good idea? We really don't have enough data to be able to actually say that for sure, that these are lines that we should be following.
Yeah, it sounds, so if you're playing this webinar's bingo, I think you just hit the replication square. So thank you, Brittany, for filling up everybody's boards at home. Heather, we got a question from Charles Darwin, and wondering if that's a real name. And Charles asked, there's significant harm suffered at the low risk and moderate risk gambler levels. Why is this not discussed enough? And before I ask you to say that, I'm actually pretty skeptical of using that as a measure. Maybe it's just the economist in me that thinks we have to look at benefits and costs at the same time. And when I think about, a low risk, moderate risk gambler, I think of somebody who's generally acting fairly rationally, even if there is some harm involved. But I'll kind of leave that to the side, and you can comment on it if you want. But do you agree that it's not discussed enough, or what's your perspective on that question?
I think because, for me personally, I've been so focused on that group that it doesn't seem to me that it's not discussed enough. I'm not sure, who is not discussing it enough. So secondary prevention programs, voluntary self-exclusion. Massachusetts has also Play My Way, which is a budgeting tool. You can consider that to be targeted more to people who are in that low to moderate risk category, who need extra help to try to keep their gambling under control. I see programs that are targeted towards that group, and especially I see a real need to, as I mentioned earlier, try to catch people before emerging problems turn into serious problems. So that's why I'm thinking about this idea about asking people early on in their gambling to try to evaluate, what their relationship with gambling is like. And one thing that I'm thinking about lately, especially, is this whole idea of dry January. I think back to New Year's Eve, I had a friend of mine over, and she just sat, in my dining room very casually and said to everyone here, I think I'm going to stop gambling for the month. I'm going to stop drinking for the month of January. I think I just want to see what that's like. And it was, nobody had any real reaction to it except for me. And that was, wow, she can just say, I'm going to stop drinking and feel no shame in that, and be able to do it before she really has any serious problem with her drinking. There's no label involved about alcohol use disorder or alcoholic. It's just an idea of evaluating and potentially resetting your relationship with a potential object of addiction. And the more we can do that for other risky behaviors like gambling, the better.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. And I think that's a really interesting idea. As we start to see things normalize around gambling, certainly in some ways. So sports betting is the example that comes to mind right now, where you're starting to see that normalization of gambling. That might be something that we see more of in the future. People saying, I'm not going to sports bet for the month of March, and it starts to shape the way that these conversations happen in the public. It's really interesting. Brittany, I'm going to pull out of the audience a question from Matt, which also got +1 by Julie, asking about when in your work with adolescents, if you looked for adolescents with problems with video game loot boxes, and as somebody who's worked with younger populations, perhaps just you can speak more generally about if this came up in your research, or what your observations are on these loot box trends, which have been featured in past seminars here.
Yeah, I didn't look specifically into loot boxes. I did ask young people, were they gambling on simulated forms of gambling? So looking at social casino games, free-to-play games. I did ask as well about fantasy sports betting, and about skins betting on things like CSGO, that type of thing, but not specifically about loot boxes. And the only reason I can really think of why I didn't do that is because I think maybe I was early. This was back, when I was planning to study back in 2016 or something. So maybe it hadn't quite blown up as it has over the past few years, or maybe I was just late to the game. But I think what I did see, I saw more adolescents in my sample that were betting on a form of simulated gambling like social casinos, skins betting, or fantasy sports than I did on any sort of for money or rather commercial forms of gambling. So I had just over a third of my sample adolescents were betting on simulated forms. And so again, I think that speaks volumes to, well, what are the kind of education programs that we're implementing? Are they specific to what these young people are actually engaging in? And importantly as well, there was a study that, and I'll probably butcher her last name, by Savigny et al., it's French, sorry, that found that 40% of the internet gambling sites that the respondents in their study visited used a return to player, so this is for simulated gambling, they used a return to player rate, which was over 100%, so that you can play these free-to-play games on the demo games or whatever, and you always get back more money, more fake money than you've put in, because it has an inflated over 100% payout rate. But when you switch to their for money games on the same companies, this was not maintained. And we know that that's obviously how gambling companies make their edge. It has to be less than 100%. So I think that's something that we should really be talking to young people about. Okay, you're playing these free-to-play games, that's fine, you're not spending any money, maybe not any problems, but don't think that when you go in to play a for money game that you're going to win at the same rate that you have been on these free-to-play games, because that can be a really problematic perception of well, gambling's a great way to make money, which it's not.
Yeah, I mean, that's an idea. I think that is also not necessarily a new one. I mean, that goes back to the Custer research about the early big win, albeit not an actual win itself, but conceptually perhaps similar in some way, shape, or form. Heather, I want to ask you a question for all of the program evaluators and program managers out there. So one of the things that we often struggle with in responsible gambling is actually measuring the effectiveness of our programs. So, when it comes to regular marketing, not necessarily public health marketing, it's easy to measure because, what we're trying to do is just look at conversions or sales. But I'm curious if, as somebody who's thought about the nature of these programs quite a bit, and I know this came up a little bit in your opening comments, is, are there any measures or metrics or targets that we should start thinking about if we're really trying to hone in on these programs' effectiveness or trying to improve the program's effectiveness?
Good question. So just to give you a little bit of background on our evaluation process, I think back to about 5 years ago, our whole evaluation started just as a customer satisfaction survey. And we had been thinking about going in and just asking questions like, did you like the experience with GameSense? Did you like the GameSense advisors? And it was as we were in the process of our evaluation, we started to think more broadly about the evaluating the impact of public health programs and going beyond satisfaction with the program to things like reach and effectiveness and so on. So I guess I would say, for one, you can skip over what we did and go straight to thinking big and thinking about a public health framework and all the different aspects that you would want to include in that. Another thing we learned was if you work really, really hard at it and have great people like the GameSense advisors in Massachusetts, you can get really great response rates. So the GSAs were getting something like 80% of the people they spoke with to complete a survey. And we learned a lot about, don't put it on an iPad because people have no idea how long it is and they don't want to commit to doing a survey when they don't know how long it is. So we learned that, put it on one sheet of paper, people can see it and know what they're committing to. Another thing we learned was in the disconnect that we had between, people saying that they learned something, and then when we actually asked them a question measuring a gambling misperception, there was a bit of a disconnect there. So we would say, don't just ask people if they learned something, follow through on that and ask them some tough questions if that's what you want to measure. And then finally, whenever possible, try to go beyond self-report. We weren't able to integrate any betting records in our evaluation, but that would be a great supplement to any survey data to try to look at actual changes in behavior from before and after exposure to a program like GameSense.
That was really, really great insight. Thank you, Heather. Brittany, this will probably be the last question of the seminar. So this question comes from Javier. It's asks, is there any evidence on prevention interventions for young people outside of school settings? And the context for this is that many schools are still reticent to address gambling-related problems, unlike other preventions. So, we had a couple of people talking on last week about public health messages, but what is your understanding of the nature of that with young people?
There are, but it's not something that I look specifically at school-based gambling education programs. So I was trying to really limit my understanding to those. As far as I'm aware, at least in Australia, I know of some that are run in like community programs, as you said. We have websites, we have sometimes television advertisements in terms of public health announcements, certainly. I think there's a real lack of evaluation. I think most of the things that have been evaluated in the literature tend to be school-based. Again, it's something that's a more controlled environment. You can get access to people to actually collect the data from. So I think that sort of limits the pools there. In terms of schools being reticent or, to talk about gambling, I understand this. And I think, we did this with drugs and alcohol a lot as well. Again, I think an absence of talking about problem gambling does not mean that it is not there. It doesn't mean that it's going to go away. And talking about or just talking about gambling in general does not necessarily introduce young people to something that they've never heard of. They're going to find out about it. They know about it. They're engaging with it. So always the best approach is to have these discussions and implement some good quality evidence-based research. And also, just in the absence of talking about problem gambling with young people, it's not that they never hear about it, because what they actually hear, what actually fills that void, is gambling advertisements. So all they are hearing then, the only noise is from gambling companies, which says, hey, we'll give you free bets. Hey, you're going to win on this. Come gamble with us. Sign up free right away. And that's not the only message that we want them to hear. So you always are working in competition with gambling advertisements.
That's a great point, Brittany, and thank you for answering that question for Javier. It seems as though we're running short on time once again. So let me wrap up the conversation here and thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Heather, for joining us on this seminar. It was very informative, and I'm sure everybody that's listening at home got several different insights about the nature of these programs and how they might research them or apply some of your insights to their work. What I'm going to do now is pass the conversation back over to Sally to tell us more about what we'll hear from next week.
Thanks very much, Kahlil, and thank you also to Brittany and Heather for that really useful conversation, everything from in-depth on how to actually run and what the content to put into, to I loved the tip of putting the questionnaires on a piece of paper. Somewhat counterintuitive for us hyper-efficient researchers, but it makes a lot of sense. So thank you both for providing your time and your expertise. It's really great to have you as part of the webinar series. So next week, we're going to be going back to our ongoing theme of gambling, gaming convergence, but as opposed to previous weeks, which you can check out on either the podcast version or the YouTube chats, where we've looked at games, so loot boxes and other aspects of games, we're going to be focusing on gambling and looking at the inclusion of skill in gambling activities. There has been a new emergence of what's being referred to as skill gaming machines or video game gambling machines. Essentially, these are electronic gaming machines, slots or pokies, depending on what jurisdiction you're from, that incorporate skill aspects, which is obviously a major departure from the previously chance-based activities that are highly prevalent and, as we all know, highly associated with gambling problems. So just to mix it up, I'm going to be speaking on this topic, given that Kahlil and I have done a fair amount of research looking at various skill gaming machines. And we're also going to be having Chanel Rush from, who's working with Dr. Mike Dixon at the University of Waterloo in the gambling research lab there. And she has worked on this topic of convergence of gambling and gaming. So we're going to be having this conversation looking at it from two different aspects. So please do join us next week. Thank you again for your ongoing attention. Please check out any of our past series in the podcast through SoundCloud or through the YouTube channel. Please tell other people who might be interested to sign up to get the link or to look at past episodes. And again, if you know any grad students, we have just under 1 week left of people being able to register. We have a few people already, and we're looking for, if we have enough, we'll definitely do another second session. So please encourage any grad student you know who is doing some interesting research. It's an excellent opportunity for them to practice their presentation skills in the absence of conferences. They can just fill out a brief form, provide some details about their research, and we're keen to feature as many up and coming researchers regardless of their level of candidature, even if they've very recently graduated as well. So please send that information to them via the Technology Addiction Team webinar homepage. So thank you again to the Brain and Mind Centre, to Harrison Sheen for hosting us and helping with tech support, and all of you for your attention and your conversation in the chat.